Marie-Rose Moreau, François Tadei and Daniel
Nous avons des rangs un petit peu
Christian
clairsemés ce
Lachat
matin.
will be
Nous allons commencer
moderating.
pour faire venir
We will be talking about reconstructing the collective future, co-constructing our respective futures, the role of creativity and imagination in crisis situations.
Daniel de Rivoire, François Tadei et Marie-Rose Moreau pour un débat animé par Christian Lachat sur reconstruire le futur, co-construire les futurs.
Bonjour tout le monde.
La créativité
Good
dans les
morning,
situations
everyone.
de crise.
Welcome to
Merci.
you all. I am delighted to moderate this roundtable this morning with three significant people in their sector. They talk about innovation, creation, which of course is the subject, the topic of this morning. I will present them to you, but I would like to start with a short memory in order to present to you the topic of this morning's roundtable. A few days after the tsunami, I was working for Doctors Without Borders, and I was invited to the launching of wonderful boats that had been constructed, built, with the help of Doctors Without Borders, a medical association. I thought this is quite strange. Doctors Without Borders who's helping building boats. So it was logistic experts, you know how important they are in all programs, and those were wonderful boats with many colors, with eyes in front of the boats in order to check and supervise the sea. And I thought, well, this is wonderful. And then I realized that all NGOs, the great associations who were present, organized that very same boat program. And there was a flourishing of these boats on the whole coastline that had been destroyed by the tsunami. Well, I thought, here we go. The sea took 200,000 bodies, and the survivors want to go to the sea again. And this very idea is the idea we will be talking about this morning. How can we, based on something that took away lives, took away possibility, capacity, agency, empowerment, how can we, in the end, take back something that was taken away from us, and how can we start living again? In order to discuss this, I would like to introduce Marie-Rose Moreau. She is psychiatry professor for children and adolescents. She is the department head of the Maison de Solesmes when it comes to the teenagers department in the Hospital Cochin in France. She worked a lot with Doctors Without Borders. She moderated and animated mental health programs for years and years. And she left quite a significant influence and trace in this very structure. Then we have François Tadei. He is a researcher, senior research fellow when it comes to training sciences. Maybe it is not sufficient to say what he actually brings forward and develops and what he has developed through a number of disciplines. At the moment, he is director for the Center for Interdisciplinary Research. He will, of course, explain to us what this is all about. And then Daniel de Rivoire, lecturer in psychology, and he's also a psychologist in Lyon, University Lyon Lumière. And he also took part in a number of programs with Doctors Without Borders, especially in Haiti. You probably understand that Haiti, in a way, is the epicenter of Libraries Without Borders actions. As far as the Libraries Without Borders, I would like to say how creative they are. So I think it is Daniel de Rivoire who will be speaking first. So he will present to us an example of actions that were led in Haiti. Thank you, Daniel. You have the floor. Thank you, Christian. It is quite interesting that you start talking about the boats, because I wanted to talk about drawings of Haitian children, because they draw many boats, especially street children. But before I come to this, I would like to thank Libraries Without Borders for at least 3 reasons. First reason, I would like to thank you for existing, very simply, because since the existence of Library Without Border, I can see that it is a structure that invests in the long term, that goes well beyond just the event, and takes interest in the long term, because we go well beyond just the spectacular part of humanitarian actions, and we invest in the long term. I would like to thank you also because you went to Haiti. This item, the book item, is significant with the history of Haiti. Yesterday, you remember it, we talked a lot about children in Haiti, where you have no power, no electricity, and many children in Haiti still try to read through maybe little oil lamps that they are able to find. And this is also very significant when it comes to the history of Haiti. We have many former slaves in Haiti who would hide in order to read, in order to have access to knowledge. So by investing, by presenting the item book as a product in order to assist, to help the people in a situation of crisis is significant. Third reason, because you invited me. You invited me so I can discuss with you on this great subject, which is construction and reconstruction. This topic is linked with a project I am coordinating on resilience and creative process in Haiti. This is quite an ambitious project. We have many objectives. One of them is to try to think about the symbolization process of the whole history of the whole Haitian people. So we draw the attention on children aged 3 to 8, but we also try to think how the Haitian people think about themselves, what strategy they actually implement in order to give sense to things, to history, and this goes well beyond just the earthquake. So in this research, I will be a little short just in order to give you a general idea. In this research, our objective is also to think about resilience of the Haitian people, but especially resilience of children and teenagers aged between 3 and 18 years old, because they are the future generation. So we study different tutors, references of resilience, the state, the religion, but the parents, the friends, etc., but also the state. The objective being to present, to introduce a number of recommendations in 3 sectors: the health, education, and arts. And it is on this that maybe we could actually do something together with Libraries Without Borders. So in order to give you an idea of the debate, well, often in humanitarian crises and situations, we think about materials, equipment. We will distribute water, rice, flour, oil, etc. This is very important, of course, because it is part of the basic needs, of the primary needs. But in our research, we tried to extend this notion of primary needs of the child, because I think that in the primary needs of the children, we also have this issue of sense. A woman who gives milk to her child, well, she also needs to have to give sense to this child, to make sure that he belongs to the community of men and women. This is why I believe it is quite interesting, this idea of ID's box, precisely, and we will have the possibility and the opportunity to come back on this, because we introduce this book item that goes well beyond just the event, the situation, because when you give a book to a child, you open a whole space of possibility, even though maybe the project, the ID's box project, will be limited on 2 or 3 years, but we are talking about this articulation, this transition. Yesterday we were talking about introducing this project as a transition project, so it's a whole challenge to understand how this will be articulated on the field. on the ground. So before I give the floor to the other speakers, I would like to come back on the fact that in our research we have a quantitative phases, a qualitative phases. I'm not going to go in details when it comes to the methodology, but in the qualitative phases, we asked children to draw. At the moment, we have 685 drawings of street children, free drawings, and it is interesting to see the topics that come out of the psyche of children. And in this topic, we talk a lot about boats, houses, boat houses as well, which are both a boat and a house, many houses that are drawn by children with water in them, or houses that are drawn covered in water or underwater as well. So it is quite interesting, and we try to understand what this says about what happens in the soul of these children, in their psyche. We will have the opportunity to come back on the sense of drawing, why we chose this medium in order to ask children to symbolize things. Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for this introduction. This gives me the possibility to underline 2 points. First, we will be talking a lot about children. Children are the incarnation of resilience, resilience of the whole population. I think we should bear in mind that all of this gave rise to a theorization of an ideology that was developed in the Warsaw Ghetto when we had a massive destruction of population and children. And children, in a way, were promoting resilience, resilience of Jews that were trapped in the Warsaw Ghetto. So children are the incarnation of resilience. And second point I would like to underline, you used an active approach, drawing. We talked a lot about reading, and maybe we will have the possibility to come back on this for adults, for children, also about something that is very important for us when it comes to psychology, that is to say, how can we tell a story, how can we tell what happened to us and project ourselves in a future? So maybe storytelling that can come out, or rather that can result in writing that would represent the second part of reading and writing. Maybe this can actually launch other reflections. Marie-Rose now. Well, good morning to you all. I am delighted to be here today and to have the opportunity to discuss about this significant idea. You know, when we arrive in places that have been completely destroyed, shattered, they are a number of processes, illusions, creations that might be the most precious thing you have in hands, and we need to preserve them, to protect them. So, of course, Libraries Without Borders is a great idea, a great realization, and I think that it is also something that will actually transform the field in which we are working. And I am particularly delighted to be here and to have the possibility to speak about this. So, of course, I will be talking about my experience with Doctors Without Borders as a psychiatrist for children as well. Since 88 or 89, with Doctors Without Borders first, we worked in Armenia. Well, this was the first time I worked with them. And the idea was to take care of children, but also to take care of reanimating in the psychology, well, in the, on the psychiatry aspect, on the philosophical aspect as well. And the idea was also, but don't we have something more important we should take care of? So I think we should definitely support this, document it, and words, books, pictures, dreams, fantasy. All of this is in a way a fantasy that takes, or rather that recognize what happens in the souls of families, groups, children, families, etc. And this is the strongest thing that happens. But in this idea, so we are talking about building on the ground, on the field, actions that support all these processes. I recognize three essential elements. The first element is to actually go there, because it does not happen all the time, and this is one of the great achievements of Libraries Without Borders. That is to say, they actually commit and they find ways of doing together. This is the second key element. They are able to work together. They do not adopt a colonialist position in a way that would take advantage of the fragility of the situation, of the shattered situation of the populations, maybe not with bad intents, but really with what they do with is actually working together, building together. So all the ideas, the analysis are extremely important, and also the feedbacks on these different approaches and the lessons learned from the past. Then the third process, I think, is essential. It is to be touched, to be moved by what you're doing. I am not only talking about what will happen to the children, to the families, but what will happen to us. The fact that we go there, that we act together, changes us. And then when we come back here in Cochin, for instance, in the hospital I work in, well, we have been transformed, we have been changed, something is changed within us. So maybe now the approach I will adopt with children today will actually take account of what I learned in Guatemala, Afghanistan, or Haiti. And I think this transition aspect is extremely important. I do not believe in good feelings that in the end do not exist anymore and can become everything and anything. I think that this is something that becomes necessary because I went there, because I left my family, my job, and maybe the comfort I have here in France. Well, through what happened there, I actually changed my approach, but also the approach I have here when I work here in France. And I think that if this interaction aspect, profound interaction aspect, does not exist, this is not sufficient. An anthropologist was talking about being touched, being moved. When you go to the field and you are moved by the world vision of maybe the person who was your informer, and thanks to him or her, I will be able to have actually a career. Well, if I was moved, if I was touched by what I lived there, and this modified my being as a professional and anything, then the process can actually keep going forward. Therefore, I believe that this idea of Library Without Borders is essential, because on top of this, there is this idea of creating together pretty things, good things that will travel afterwards. Christian, you can stop me whenever you want, but I would like to give you two examples. One which is quite classical on Guatemala because it touches children and it moved me, but also another example in Afghanistan because it touches adults. Of course, children are essential and fundamental, but I think that in these situations of disaster, rupture, catastrophes, we should never forget the fact that adults have the need to dream, to think as well for themselves, but for their children as well. In Guatemala, I was struck by a wonderful project, I think, So a project in a favela, in a disorganized, poor and vulnerable district, Lomas de Santa Fe, at the districts of Guatemala City. They had just started organizing themselves, or, well, in the whole lack of organization, they started to organize. They had no electricity, no water, no food, just waste around and everywhere. So in this district, we had mainly children and women living there. Women who in the morning would go and work in the great houses of Guatemala City, and every morning they would leave the children to be actually supervised by older women who were not able to work anymore, and maybe during the day they'd fall asleep and they would forget that they had to take care of the children, or rather women who were desperate by the whole situation, who didn't have enough to eat, and so who would just fall asleep during the day. And this was the supervision which was available for everyone. So children were actually living with older people and with animals, pets. So you would have just children with dogs around them, and dogs were kind of used as taking care of the children. And in this very space, someone had the idea, and this is how it came up to Doctors Without Borders. We actually wanted to have a kindergarten for children in difficulty. So it was a therapeutic, a healing kindergarten for children with development problems, who wouldn't walk, who wouldn't smile, who wouldn't talk. And at some point we had kind of a movement of the population. So one day, and this was the only ritual moment we had, once a week we would celebrate a religious ritual, and around this mass we had a movement. In this movement, women, mothers, got angry, and their anger was against the foreigners in this camp, but also against Doctors Without Borders, and they got angry at us. Why? Well, they said, you are going to build a kindergarten, a healing kindergarten for those who don't walk, who do not eat, who do not smile, and who do not learn. Well, very good, but they said, we do not believe that this kindergarten should just be for children in difficulty, but for all children, because all children are not doing well. Even the children who walk and who speak, they have no dreams, they are not able to imagine a future for themselves, they are not doing well. And so they started a whole advocacy process, an advocacy process for the dream, to promote fantasy, creation, and everything for all children. And they were right, because we started with an idea, the way we always do in urgency situation. We build a hierarchy. So we'll say, well, these children, not only they're not doing well, but on top of this, we can actually help them, and we believe that maybe we can help them, and then there are all the other children. So we have kind of this cynical hierarchy we build just for us to actually be able to act, to do something, to go there and act. So usually we talk about this idea of hierarchy just because then maybe we recognize that we will be able to save lives or save children. So we had in Guatemala a real rebellion movement that was quite significant, and that was expressed as a advocacy for what we need to have for children to be able to survive, but just to live as well. And what was very important for the mothers was for mothers not to see their children repeating the very same patterns when it came to the organization of the place, of the society. And this moved me profoundly. Then, of course, we had to discuss, to negotiate, in order to be able to organize a program. And in the end, it was not Doctors Without Borders who actually organized the whole program, but we made sure that there was this possibility not only to have a healing kindergarten, but also a normal kindergarten. Shall I talk about adults or shall I leave it for later? Well, maybe you could leave it for a later moment in the debate so we can illustrate it. Well, since yesterday, what we actually see is that we have new stakeholders, new players in the humanitarian sector, and these new players, how will they find their role, the role they should play with what already exists? So I'm talking about first aid, preserving and protecting the children. So we have new associations, and I am thinking, for instance, about care and education, which is the current concept we work around, so around children, of course. And this concept associates the taking care in a very broad idea to development, intelligence, cognitive, affective aspect as well. So, François, maybe you could push us a little bit, encourage us with the different concepts that you can bring around these notions as well.
Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me. I like this concept of ideas box. If I should summarize it for others, it's a box to think outside the box. It's something that we add to what people think for them to think differently. It can go, it can work through reading, but also through exchanging and producing knowledge by ourselves, taking pictures, describing the environment we are in. We are a player in the world we are in. So we can start producing knowledge and exchanging it and co-building that knowledge. And I'd like to give you an example about a project in Colombia. Bill Clinton has said that Vicky, who is in charge of the project, is one of the 4 women that could change the world. She's an exceptional woman. She started working on empowering a farmers' community in Colombia, including in war-torn areas. And her project developed in other areas, including Haiti. And what is interesting is that a concept is to educate children to democracy and to the capacity to understand the world in which they live and to settle issues and cooperate together with adults based on this on the fact that children can contribute to the environment they live in. As a researcher, recently I invited Alison Gopling. She's a researcher in Berkeley University, and she demonstrated that we are all born researchers. That means that all children and adults are researchers potentially. And the issue is how to feed this world, to question the world we live in, and how to draw hypotheses and to test them. That is really a scientific approach, and we see that children try things and ask questions about what's happening around them. And she says that children are the R&D service of humanity, of mankind. That is true for other species. And it is indeed a very interesting concept. So how can we feed that potential that children have? I think that Ideas Box and large part of Lawyers Without Borders programs do contribute to that. We can build an ecosystem in which someone who builds something can help someone else learn something. It can happen at the local level, but also at the international level through, in particular, the internet. What is interesting in that ecosystem, and I'll give you an example, that started in suburbs in France. It's a mutual knowledge network. The first idea is that everybody knows something. The second idea is nobody that knows everything. And the third idea is that we all benefit from exchanging our knowledge, so we can mutually enrich each other. And those are education approaches, are mutual approaches. We can see that it can be used in all environments, including in environments where there have been destructions and everything is to be rebuilt. And so the community can contribute to finding solutions and making the most of those solutions. When one child has found one solution, he can share it. There's an American researcher that invented a lamp that works with human heat. The source of energy is the human body. She's 15, but we can see that that kind of innovation must be shared, including in an environment in which Lawyers Without Borders intervenes. And so we should help those children and tell them that kind of lamps exist and they can use it. There is another kid from Chile who invented an early warning system for earthquakes. He's 14. He used it is based on open source software. And based on those technologies that he linked to his mobile phone, he has a captor that can detect vibrations, shakes, and so he can transmit by SMS and tweets that there will be an earthquake. And you can see that earthquakes in Chile are a big issue, and so we can have the warning before the earthquake spreads to our area. So those are ideas by children, and it's particularly interesting. I think it is important to show that children have this capacity. We all say children, and having adults that continue to dream, that continue to share their dreams, it is important. When children are in a position to do the same thing, we as adults think that we can do the same thing, and together we can contribute to the solution. Nobody has the silver bullets, but we can all find a solution, a co-built solution that can help the whole community move forward. Well, we set up a place in Paris called the CRI, the Interdisciplinary Research Center. That's where I met Jérémy. It is a place where fundamentally all players, including the students, are invited to come and suggest projects and share those projects. I was very surprised when I discovered that many players in the field had the same kinds of projects. It is a place where we try to remove barriers, frontiers, borders, disciplinary frontiers, but also the frontiers that we set ourselves. Let's imagine someone behind bars They look desperate, and if we take a few steps back, we see that that person is in the middle of the countryside. So it means that that person should take a look around him or her and see that actually he or she is free. Sometimes there are barriers that we set for ourselves, and children are very good when it comes to removing those barriers because they look for things, so working on their drawings, on their imagination, on their creativity, on the world they'd like to live in. I think it would be very positive. Okay, so I know the work of Alison Gopnik on the baby researcher because she works on babies, and we do.
Ça va nous permettre de rebondir. Je connais bien les travaux de
an approach in psychiatry, which is the pleasure to play, enjoying playing. It's true that a baby spends maybe 80% of his or her time taking ownership of the world he or she lives in, playing, trying, and someone that we like, Winnicott, who was an English psychiatrist who has been working in children in times of war, analyzed playing, and we can say the same thing about books. Writers talked about it yesterday, remarkably. It can be a way to learn, a way to communicate, and also just a way to read, to enjoy reading. And playing is the same thing. It's a possibility to learn, to take ownership of new things, to emulate things and behaviors. And it's also very simply a way to enjoy oneself and to play. Could you talk about Haiti, about this aspect, imagination and creation? I'd like to go back, however, to what François Tadei has said, and to what Marie-Rose has said too. The idea is to go and give children keys for them to learn by themselves. It reminds me of an example that we had with the Philosopha Association. Philosopha is an association that organized art and philosophy workshops in Haiti. With the Lyon de University, we thought about the contents. There is a children who was asked, what do you do when you face a problem? How do you settle that issue? He thought about it for a few seconds, and he said, when I have a problem, I ask my thinking process to help me. I think it's a very strong statement. It means that a child knows that you can count on him or herself. So the humanitarian approach should be to have the affected population understand that they can help themselves. If we give populations and children books, whatever the book is an object that transmits knowledge, then the children can use those books. I'd like to bounce back on what Marie-Rose Moreau has said about how children experience disasters. Beyond the physical damage, the affected population must know that they will have the help of human beings, and they must be considered as human beings. And it means that the humanitarian assistance must show its human face, because what happens in a traumatizing situation, you lose your humanity. And when humanitarian teams, in the word humanitarian, you have the word human, but sometimes
comment dire,
The
leur
affected
part
populations
humaine.
feel
Parce que
that they have lost
qu'est-ce qui se
their
passe dans les
humanity.
situations traumatiques?
They
On est
have the feeling
déshumanisé.
that they are not
Et très souvent, quand
enough
les
taken into
humanitaires
account
arrivent,
when
bon, l'humanitaire,
what
on
they
a quand même
feel
l'humanité, mais parfois ça
can
va à
be a
l'encontre
tool,
de la tâche
it can
primaire
be a bridge
des missions
towards
humanitaires, parce que
understanding them
souvent,
better.
les risques se sentent
And that's
déshumanisés, ils sentent qu'on ne les
what we
prend pas
do when we use
suffisamment en considération.
vehicles
Donc,
such as
quand on fait
drawings.
de l'affect
We are
un outil,
talking
il me semble
about
que ça peut
how to
permettre
co-build
ce
the
pont,
future. I
ce
think
pont
that
sur
drawing
l'équilibre. Et c'est
is a way
effectivement
to
ce qu'on
see yourself in the
le pari qu'on
future,
fait
because
avec les objets médiateurs comme
drawing
le dessin. Parce que là, on
helps
est
see
dans
the
une
future, but
thématique sur la
also
reconstruction du futur, comment co-construire
the
ensemble.
past
Il me semble
in
que le dessin, ça permet
post-traumatic situations
justement cette
and
projection dans le futur. Parce que le
traumatic
dessin,
situations.
ça permet une
Sometimes
projection
we
dans le
expect
futur,
the
ça
affected
permet aussi
population to
la
talk
projection
immediately
du
about
passé.
what
C'est
has
ça le côté,
happened, and very
paradoxal.
often those populations are
En
worried
situation
about
traumatique,
something else.
post-traumatique,
But
il y a
if
souvent
we
ce qu'on appelle le gel
help
de
them
l'affect.
with
C'est-à-dire que
objects
quand il y a
such
des
as
humanitaires qui arrivent, on a envie
drawing,
que l'autre parle tout de suite
they
de
can
son
take a few
traumatisme.
steps
Et parfois c'est
back,
violent, c'est difficile
a
parce
few
que parfois les gens
steps
ils sont plus
back,
préoccupés par autre chose qu'à
and
exprimer
think
leurs
about what
émotions.
they went through.
Mais en leur proposant
So
par
you see that
exemple des
here
objets médiateurs
there's
comme le dessin, ça leur permet de prendre une certaine
it is a
distance par
way
rapport
for
à ce qu'ils vivent au quotidien pour actualiser
for us to
un peu un certain nombre de
understand what
vécus
those
antérieurs et
populations
aussi se
went
projeter
through.
dans l'avenir. Mais tout cela se
We
fait
had
dans l'ici et maintenant. Donc
685
vous voyez que là,
drawings,
il y a une sorte d'écrasement
and
du temps chronologique pour laisser apparaître
in
tout
these
ce qui
drawings,
concerne
children
le temps,
express
le
things
temps
from the
psychique, comme on dit
past,
dans
from
notre-
their
dans notre
past.
jargon.
For example,
Et
most
ce qu'on
of
a
these
pu observer
children
à travers les 685 dessins,
rest avec
juste un
children.
petit mot,
Those were children
dire
that
que
were
dans
put
ces
in
dessins,
foster
les
care,
enfants
but
expriment
not
des choses
in
du
foster
passé,
care as itself,
de leur
in
passé,
foster
par exemple.
families,
La
but
plupart,
very often
de ces enfants avaient
it is
été
an
des enfants
additional
restent avec,
trauma that
des
is
enfants
add
restent
to the
avec, comme
trauma
on
they
dit,
already
ce sont
went
des
through.
enfants
We saw
qui sont
in these
placés, en France,
drawings
on dit des enfants confiés à la protection de l'enfance, mais sauf que ce sont des enfants qui sont confiés dans des
hints
familles.
of
Parfois
what they
ça se
went
passe bien,
through, about
la
the
plupart du temps ça se
violence,
passe très mal puisque ces enfants-là sont encore plus
about
traumatisés. Dans
things
ces
about
familles.
humanitarian
On a vu dans ces
teams.
dessins
So you
des
have
traces de ces
planes
violences-là.
in those
On a
drawings
vu dans
with
ces dessins des traces de violence que vivent les
there
enfants
are
dans la rue.
also
On voit aussi dans ces
houses
dessins,
with flags of the teams
tout,
intervening in
ce qui
Haiti,
concerne l'aide
we see
humanitaire, par
also,
exemple, qui dessine des avions, des hélicoptères avec les
houses
sigles
which
aussi
are
des ONG.
boats.
C'est
So we
impressionnant.
see really the
On voit des
path
églises, des maisons qui sont surmontées de
followed
drapeaux,
by the
drapeaux haïtiens,
creative,
drapeaux de tous les autres pays
process
qui
in
interviennent
these
en
children.
Haïti. On
Now,
voit
to
on
go
voit aussi,
back
comme je
to
disais tout à l'heure,
what
des
Christian
maisons,
said earlier,
des maisons bateaux, des maisons qui flottent.
the
C'est là qu'on
issue
voit
of
qu'il y a
reading
toute une sorte
is
de
important in the
trajectoire
ideas
justement
box,
du processus
and drawing and
du
reading
processus
are part
créateur
and parcel of the
chez,
same
chez ces
process.
enfants-là. Et
To read,
pour revenir un petit peu sur ce que disait
to
Christian
give a new
tout à l'heure,
life
il est question
to
du lire
the
avec
thinking
les dialogues,
process,
il est
because
question
those
de
are
notre recherche des
vehicles.
dessins. Il me semble que les deux
And when one is
participent
traumatized,
du même
one
processus
is limited in
de
one
réactivation,
representation of the
justement,
world,
de
and that's what
symbolisation, de représentation,
leads to
parce que ce sont des
suffering.
objets
If you had
médiateurs,
playing
qui permettent
and drawing, you can be in
de mettre
different
du jeu
situations.
dans les représentations, parce que
Marie-Rose,
quand on est traumatisé, on est coincé dans
about
une
those
représentation.
drawings,
C'est surtout cela qui fait souffrir.
uh,
Et en mettant
the
du jeu
Brunner
dans les
during the
représentations, ça
war
permet
had
de se
invented
positionner
the methodology
un peu
that
différemment.
we find spontaneously, which was to ask children three
Alors, on va
drawings,
demander à
one on
Marie-Rose
the past,
de
one on the
rebondir,
present,
là,
one on the future.
juste sur les
And
dessins,
they were
des ancêtres de tout ça, c'est du Brunner,
introducing
hein,
a
pendant la guerre.
therapeutic
Ils avaient inventé
dynamic,
cette petite
a
méthodologie
healing dynamic.
spontanément,
So
qui était de
you get
demander
out
aux
of the
enfants trois
present
dessins,
that can
un
be
sur
a
le
real
passé, un sur
prison,
le présent et un sur l'avenir. Et ils
can be a
introduisaient
refugee
comme ça
camp,
une dynamique thérapeutique.
it
hein,
can
tout à
be
fait dans-
a shanty
on
town
discute
in
là
France,
actuellement,
it
qui est
can
que
be
on sort de
being
ce présent
forbidden
infernal et emprisonnant.
to do
Là, pour le coup, c'est
anything.
des vrais barreaux qui peuvent être
And
un
so,
certain nombre de réfugiés, mais qui peuvent être des réfugiés
really,
en France dans des CADA où ils ont
It is very
interdiction
important
de faire quoi que ce
to give
soit,
a new
par exemple,
dynamic
et où on sent bien que
to
là, il
the
y a une
past,
vraie
the present,
perte
and
de
the future.
cette
Children do that
quincy,
spontaneously.
c'est-à-dire
Maybe it's more difficult for adults, and Marie-Rose may be a second example for us to better understand what we talk about.
Donc, ça, c'est
Yes, indeed.
vraiment
Earlier, I
très
thought that
important de
ideas
redynamiser.
boxes are a great
Ça, c'est présent
thing
futur,
for
les
children,
enfants le font spontanément. C'est peut-être un peu plus dur pour les adultes. Et donc,
but it must also
mon deuxième exemple va nous
help
permettre
adults. I
de
was
mieux
thinking
comprendre.
about a situation
Oui.
that really
Effectivement, je
touched
pensais
me.
tout à l'heure que les idées à box, c'est génial pour,
I had
pour les
worked with
enfants,
Afghan
et,
refugees in
mais
Pakistan,
aussi ça devrait
And
pouvoir
then,
faire beaucoup de bien aux adultes. Alors je pensais à une situation là aussi
10
qui
years
m'avait
later,
beaucoup touchée.
those refugees,
donc,
or at least some of them,
c'était donc
came
je travaillais
back
dans
to
un premier temps avec
Afghanistan,
les réfugiés afghans
and Doctors Without Borders
au Pakistan,
opened
et puis
up
ensuite,
programs
c'est,
on the return
donc
on their way
années
back.
plus tard,
I was in Kabul,
ces
in the
réfugiés,
Kabul
certains
neighborhood.
d'entre eux ont pu
There was a
rentrer en
transit
Afghanistan.
camp,
Et là, Médecins sans frontières donc, a ouvert
and
des
I
programmes
wanted to know what
sur
we
le
could
chemin
do
du
for
retour
children.
De ces réfugiés. Et
But
donc, moi,
children
j'étais allée donc, près de Kaboul, dans
are
Kaboul où il y avait un
come with adults, so we opened the first
et
consultancy
pour voir ce qu'on
to
pouvait faire pour,
understand the issues
pour
and to know how we
pour
could
les enfants. Mais
take
bien
up
sûr,
those challenges.
les
And
enfants,
those
ils sont portés par,
refugees coming back to
des
Afghanistan were
adultes. Et donc,
mostly women,
on
because
a ouvert
men
une première
had
consultation
died in
pour,
the war,
pour voir un peu quelles étaient les problématiques.
and a few of
comment on
them
pouvait agir.
had stayed in camps in
Et puis,
Pakistan
j'ai
with
vu
the idea that the war
alors,
was not
les
completely
réfugiés
over.
qui rentraient, c'était beaucoup des femmes. Les hommes étaient beaucoup
And
étaient
so
morts
we
dans
saw
la guerre.
these women
Et
and
puis
these
certains étaient
mothers.
restés dans les camps au Pakistan, sans doute avec l'idée que la guerre n'était pas totalement finie.
Saying very painful
Et donc,
things. They were mentioning ordeals
voyait
that were
défiler
unbearable to
ces femmes et
listen
ces
to,
mères
and
très
wanted to help them rebuild their future. And there was an
douloureuses, enfin.
old
Elle,
lady,
elle
she
disait
looked
des
old at
choses,
least,
parfois
and she
insoutenables
stayed,
sur les différentes
she
épreuves
never
qu'elle
get
devait
into
traverser.
my
L'idée,
office.
c'était de voir
She
avec
was
elle
sat
comment on
on the
pouvait,
floor.
les aider à reconstruire quelque chose. Puis il y avait
She
une
was
vieille
there,
dame,
and
enfin vieille dame,
day in,
elle avait
day
l'air
out,
d'une
she
dame,
came back, but she never went
qui
into my
restait,
office.
À la porte
And
de
when
la
she was asked if
consultation,
she
qui
needed
rentrait jamais à la
something, she wanted to
consultation,
say something,
qui
she
était assise par
bowed her
terre et
head
qui,
and she refused to talk. One day,
qui était
2
là. Et
days,
donc, jour
3
après
days,
jour,
and
elle
the seventh
revenait, mais elle ne
day,
rentrait jamais dans la consultation.
I come to her with an interpreter.
Et quand on lui demandait si elle avait
And
besoin, si elle voulait quelque chose, si
I
elle voulait nous dire quelque
introduce
chose, elle
myself.
baissait la tête et elle
I tell her that
refusait de parler. Bon, un jour, deux jours,
I see
trois
that she's
jours, le
desperate and
septième
that I
jour,
don't understand what's happening,
je m'approche
and
d'elle,
that
avec
maybe
la
she can
traductrice,
explain to me
et,
how we can help her.
je lui
She
j'essaye
doesn't speak,
je
but
me
she agrees
présente,
to
je lui dis que
enter
j'ai besoin qu'elle me,
my office. She
je la
was
vois
wearing a
désespérée,
veil.
je
She
comprends pas ce
removed
qui
that
arrive,
veil,
et que peut-être elle peut m'expliquer comment on
and she
peut
starts
l'aider.
asking questions
Et là,
to
elle
us.
parle toujours
Why
pas,
we
puis elle
are
rentre
here,
dans la
what
salle
we are
de
going to do next,
consultation.
if we have
Et,
children.
elle était voilée, elle se
To
dévoile.
myself
et
and to my translator.
Elle commence à
Do
nous
we plan
poser
to stay? What
nous.
we are going to do with the things we are going to listen and to hear?
Des enfants,
Well, she asks questions that are
Après,
quite unusual
est-ce que,
because those
on a
questions were very
l'intention,
intense, and she was
de
very
rester,
direct.
ou alors,
She
qu'est-ce qu'on va
also
faire avec des
asks
choses
if
qu'on
we
va
have a
entendre,
religion,
qu'on a
if we believe in a
entendues
God.
Donc,
She
elle nous pose
asks
vraiment des questions
questions
dont on n'a
about
pas
what we
l'habitude
think
d'une
and why we're here and what we are going to do next.
intensité, puis monsieur,
And we answer.
quelque chose de vraiment
The
extrêmement
translator
direct. Elle
answers.
demande aussi si
I
on croit
answer.
dans un Dieu. Bon, elle nous
Without
pose
really
un certain nombre de questions sur, on va dire, nos affiliations, nos croyances et pourquoi
Knowing
on
what
est
she
là. Quoi.
expects.
Et qu'est-ce qu'on va faire avec
And
ça?
once she's
on
asked
répond.
all the questions
La
she wanted to ask, she says
aussi,
that
tout le monde, enfin, on
maybe at the end of the day we cannot understand something that are very important. So she tells her story. She had three sons and two daughters. The three men
peut-être on n'est pas capable de
went
comprendre
to the war and never came back. They died.
Et puis là,
The first
elle dit 2-3
daughter
choses sur ce qui lui est arrivé. Donc elle avait 3 garçons
was
et 2 filles. Les 3 garçons étaient morts les uns après les autres. Les 3 hommes, donc,
to an old man who was also living in the camp.
La première fille a été
the lady thinks that she was
dans le camp au Pakistan.
poorly married and that she lost the appetite for life, and she died when delivering her first child. And so she decided to come back to her village with the second daughter, a village in southern Afghanistan, for things to happen normally, so to speak, and for her daughter to be married normally. And so she came back with Malal, Malam.
Pour que les choses puissent se passer normalement et qu'elle puisse être mariée normalement et pas dans les conditions où sa première
And then
fille
she stops again and she says
et
that
elle est rentrée donc avec Malam.
we haven't,
Malal, je me trompe. Malam, on va
because we haven't
et,
gone
Malam.
through what she's gone
donc,
through, we cannot understand what happened
Malam.
to her.
Et puis là, elle s'arrête de nouveau. Et puis elle dit
And I
que
thought,
on
well,
peut pas-
she will stop sharing what
nous qui
she
avons pas
started
vécu
sharing.
des
She
choses comme
put
ça, on
her
peut pas
veil
comprendre,
on, she sat on the floor, and
Puis là, elle se tait, mais
she no longer speaks.
que je vis comme un peu définitif, quoi.
And so there is a kind of a frontier between us. And I try to think about what could continue that link. And the BBC taught us that when you can no longer speak, you can play. Sometimes you can play. That's what we call psychodrama in our lingo. I only had my imagination, I did not have an ideas box. And I said to that woman, if we cannot speak, we are going to play. Let's do a role play. Okay, you'll play the part of my daughter Malam, she says. I play the part of my mother, and the translator will play my part. And at the beginning, I'm quite surprised. I suggest that we play, and for it's obvious. She distributes the parts quite easily, and so she changes the parts. She says, well, let's stop and let's move on to another part. So she starts playing, and actually what happened, and that we discovered through that role play, was that Malam passed away while coming back to Afghanistan. Her mother feels guilty because she thinks that it's her fault. She wanted a daughter to be married in a dignified way in a village with respect, with all the traditions. That's why she came back, and coming back, her daughter passed away, and since then she is restless. She sees her daughter, comes to her to tell her, you killed me. So we use that psychodrama, psycho role play, to say things that are very complex, that are very hard, to talk about the consequences of mourning, of despair, of violence. And this grandmother
pour dire des choses qui sont d'une complexité terrible,
could tell her story through this role play. And at the end, she stops that role play, puts a veil on, and tells me, now you can tell to those who send you here that even in violence, even in despair, what matters most is to live in a dignified way. And I ask her, what's your name? Well, I am Madame's mother. The only identity she wanted to keep was the fact that she was Madame's mother, and so we used this role play to say very complex things. I thought that the strength, the creativity, and this will to live in a dignified way, despite the violence, was stronger than everything. Thank you for that example. We've talked about drawing, of role play, Madame. It reminds me of Malala. We could actually say that this colloquium is held on her behalf. She was shot because of her ideas box. Her ideas box is her head, her brain, her heart. François, you said earlier that, well, maybe you have other ideas. You talked about shared knowledge, that is very fascinating concept. Maybe you could develop, elaborate on that. But you mentioned also something very important, which was education to peace. Could you tell us something about that, or would you rather talk about other concepts that you have in your ideas box?
Well, education for peace, this is a wonderful concept, I believe. It is still to be invented, but we need to invent it together with the children. We have a form of violence in ourselves, and the more violence we suffered, the more we tend to believe that the world functions through violence. So we need to work on ourselves, but also collectively. So I do not have a one-made or a ready-made solution, but let's look at what Mrs. Colbert does, for instance. She organizes elections. During the elections, the children decide who will represent them, on which topic they wish to work, which collective activities or initiatives they want to organize. So we are thinking about interior peace, but also collective dynamic. I think this is part of education for peace. Aristotle was saying it. We have three types of knowledge. Episteme, scientific knowledge, which were multiplied by 100 every centuries. We have technical knowledge, technologies, etc. And this doubles every 18 months, so it is a lot. And then we have phronesis, that was ethics of action. So for the first two, they increased greatly whether the action didn't develop according to the same dynamics, and we can actually be surprised to see that it is not part of what we actually transfer. We transfer knowledge, but do we transfer know-how, know to be, know to live together? Do we do that as well? Because this is essential as well for the human activity that every single one of us should represent. How can we transfer that, educate children to this? When we observe the transfer of ideas, I like T.S. Eliot, who said, when the wisdom that we lost in knowledge, where is the information we lost, or where is the wisdom we lost in knowledge, etc. So how can we build back again this going from data to knowledge to wisdom? Is wisdom just imposed to us through moral authorities, inherited or whatever from an ancient world, or is wisdom something we can work on, every single one of us? Confucius used to say that this wisdom, we could look for it alone, but of course it was something quite difficult to do because we usually learn from mistakes, from our own mistakes. We can also do it just through reflection, but this is even more difficult, I think. The best way to look for a solution is always to be introspective, look inside our own brain. But then to find solutions, we can also exchange with others to understand their visions. But is it an exchange or will someone impose their vision? So I think that it is quite interesting. And today, those concepts, either we receive it in a way that it is a little too structured and therefore we struggle to actually accept them, or we need to accept or to invent rather something else. And I think that promoting children to work together on this is extremely important. We really need to work on these know to be, know to live, because this is what motivates us in the end, because once you're motivated, you could do anything. Another example. The youngest authors of scientific publications are aged 8 years old, so they were very motivated. I have a friend who never did any scientific studies, and she discovered alone that her 2 children had the same genetic disease, and today she published more than 100 papers on this. So as from the moment you have a strong motivation and you have access to knowledge, maybe through ID's box, maybe other ID's box will have to be invented constantly, especially taking into account the ID's box we have in ourselves, in our brains, in our hearts. Maybe we can actually create a real network, and this is what is happening, this ability to work in a network. It means that when someone finds something, he can fine-tune it, exchange with others, and go even further in his knowledge. This is, of course, a characteristic of our species. Language allowed us to do this. We know that language, though, can be the best and the worst of things. And technology is the same. It can be the best or the worst of things. Every transfer method can be a domination tool, an SA who is supervising us, looking at hearing everything we say. Can we be held responsible for our feelings, our emotions? But technology can also be the same, because we use it to construct together, thanks to our ideas, our emotions. Together we build this education 2-piece and 4-piece for tomorrow's world. So do we still have a few minutes? Okay, so we can launch the debate. If the audience has a few questions or would like to ask a few questions to the speakers.
Il reste un petit peu de temps. Oui. Donc on va prendre 2-3 questions de la salle pour...
Bonjour, je voudrais demander monsieur...
Good morning, Mr. de Rivoire. This work, did you lead it as well in other countries? What you're doing now in Haiti, is it the very first, or did you do it beforehand? No, we intervened in Haiti for the first time, even though in the framework of our research, the research we lead in Lyon 2, we are, for instance, comparing Haitian children's drawings to children in Morocco who did drawings as well. But this is not the humanitarian initiative, but I have a student who is doing her dissertation on drawings of street children in Morocco. And what was striking is that many street children in Morocco draw boats, many boats, once again. So once again, we can, in a way, think again about the sense we wanted to give to the drawings of boats with the children in Haiti. So this maybe can be seen as a perspective of traveling. Those children want to travel, not only geographically travel, but in their soul as well. They want to travel. and we try to understand what it sends back to in their psyche, in their soul. So of course, everything which is being implemented in Haiti gives us idea, and those same initiatives might be deployed in other countries or in other contexts. For instance, we validated a scale in order to study resilience. We validated this scale and applied it in Haiti, and we will try to understand how we can actually transpose them in other regions. We also work hand in hand with Paris 13, the University of Paris 13, so we have Lyon 2, University Paris 13 University, the State University in Haiti, and Editech as well. Paris 13 University works with a test, a scale that has been experimented in other countries. Maybe Marie-Rose can say a few words on this. This has been validated in other countries, so now we are experimenting this in Haiti as well to understand the transcultural aspect of those tests as well. Yes, this is a scale called Psy-K. We validate it in a transcultural way. So in a cross-cultural way, you can use it whatever the country, whatever the language, and the objective is to identify the suffering of infants and very young children aged between 3 and 6, and now we are doing the same for children aged between 18 months and 6 years old. So it's a very, very simple scale. We have a little box as well, and this allows us to understand what is happening, and the scale for the children aged between 3 and 6 is now available to everyone. Doctors Without Borders and Epicenter, a research organism, validated it, and it is available to everyone who would like to use them. Yes, I would like to add that for this research, we are working on a parasysmic model of psyche. That is to say, we look at health, or rather we use 3 pillars: health, arts and culture to build the psyche and the soul, and we are trying to explore this, to study this, and to understand whether or not we can export it and use it in other contexts as well. I would like to take this opportunity to say that we will present the results of this research in Haiti in a symposium 9 to 12 of January, and you are all warmly invited, because those results will be presented to representatives in Haiti, but also others, in order to give information on what is expected by the people on the ground. I think there is another question. Yes, it is question and remark. I had the opportunity to assist at the beginning of July to the IDA Congress. It was a world congress with artists and players of formal and informal education, as well as performing arts representatives. So this is a very lively association with also Young ID project, where young people commit and volunteer in different countries around psychodrama, for instance, because this is quite interesting. And I took part in a workshop that was working around Edouard Bond work as from a dramatic work or piece or play that you can maybe offer it to anyone and make the link with people in a situation of crisis. So the idea was, through a psychodrama, how can you actually talk about your own personal drama and give it words, use words to actually describe it. But I think it would be quite interesting to work hand in hand with actors, writers. I work with that in libraries around authors' residence. I think we should go deeper into that. We have Clowns Without Borders. This is very interesting as well, but maybe partnerships with artists authors and writers would be interesting. Artists do interrogate the world in an exacerbated way because poets are important, and maybe in a second phase they could be committed as well to have a sustainable process for refugees and other populations. Well, unfortunately, we do not have time for other questions unless that question is very short. Well, I wanted to talk about sustainability and support after the trauma. Because you explained, you talked about the time of the trauma, the period of the study, but I think that support must go well beyond it. It must go well beyond the trauma period. So I would like to know whether you have involvement projects on a longer term. So this is still need to be found. We need to develop this articulation between what we do in an urgency situation, what we do in just after the urgency, and then on the longer term with the development. I think that the question is a right question to ask, but the answer is so complex that we can't give it to you right now. But this is a critical question, of course, and thank you for asking it, because it is critical for humanitarian work. I will be very brief. I wanted to say that I was lucky enough in spring to go to Haiti to take part in the building of a library in Colline des Landes. And I would like to ask Library Without Borders if they could bring their support, not only moral support, but practical support as well for this project. It's quite brief, but very serious from me. Well, you should go and talk directly to the executive director about this. He will be here in just a minute. So we will wrap up this roundtable. I would like to thank all the speakers. We had a real exchange with them. They shared their knowledge with us, and I think that we found ourselves in the ideas box during this roundtable. And now let's go to C again on colored boats.
Merci beaucoup. On va faire 10 petites minutes.
Thank you. We'll have a 10 minutes break, and we will start again at 10:30 for the next debate.
Maintenant, nous allons reprendre la mer sur les barques.
Merci beaucoup. On va faire 10 petites minutes de pause. On reprend à 10h30 pour un nouveau débat. Merci.